Elena Hart signed the last page with the kind of hand that no longer trembled because it had gone numb. The conference room on the 32nd floor smelled like lemon polish, expensive paper, and rain trapped in wool coats. Outside the glass wall, Manhattan had dissolved into a gray blur. Taxis crawled below like yellow insects. People hurried through puddles. Somewhere down there the city was moving with purpose, and up here Elena was ending a marriage with a line of black ink and a last name she had never fully learned how to wear. Her attorney slid the folder gently toward herself, as if the papers might bite. "It's done." That should have felt like relief. Instead, Elena felt only an odd hollow pressure in the center of her chest, as if something inside her had been scooped out too quickly. 3 years of marriage. 11 months of silence. 4 weeks of lawyers. 9 signatures. One final stroke, and Julian Mercer was now almost her past. Almost. She rose too fast, dizzy from the coffee she had not finished and the breakfast she had skipped. "Send me whatever I need to finalize by email." Sloane Bennett, sleek in charcoal silk and calm in the way only attorneys and surgeons ever seemed calm, stood with her. "There is one procedural requirement." Elena reached for her coat. "Of course there is." Sloane hesitated. It was the first crack Elena had seen in her composure since this entire ugly process began. "What?" Elena asked. "The dissolution itself is signed," Sloane said carefully. "But under the Mercer Family Trust there is an activated appendix tied to jointly held charitable assets." Elena stared at her. "I'm sorry," Sloane added, and now she sounded less like a lawyer and more like a person who wished to be somewhere else. "Because you signed without contesting the trust attachments, you also agreed to temporary co-trusteeship over the Ashbourne Harbor Foundation until the final review hearing." For a second Elena thought she had misheard her. "The what?" "The foundation. Mercy House, the harbor properties, the Women's Recovery Center, the school annex, and the Coastal Land Reserve. 90-day residency requirement. Joint fiduciary oversight with Mr. Mercer." The room went utterly still. Elena let out one short laugh that sounded nothing like humor. "No." Sloane opened the folder again, turned 3 pages, and pointed. Small print. Dense. Vicious. The legal language swam before Elena's eyes. "You're telling me I just signed divorce papers," she said slowly, "and somehow agreed to spend 90 days working with my husband. Your estranged husband. That is not a better sentence. The clause has existed for years. It was attached to your marriage agreements when you joined the trust structure." "I never joined a trust structure. I got married in a courthouse wearing boots because it was raining." Sloane's face softened. The legal world rarely cares how romantic the weather was. Elena snatched the file, flipped pages she could barely process, and found the signature line again, her own name sitting there in brutal confidence. Elena Hart Mercer. She had not used Mercer in almost a year, but there it was, obedient and stupid and permanent. 90-day residency. Joint trustee presence required on-site. Final dissolution stayed pending completion of review and disposition vote. Her stomach dropped. "What happens if I refuse?" "The foundation assets revert to emergency board control pending litigation. Given the current sale motions from the Mercer board, Mercy House would likely be liquidated within weeks." Elena looked up sharply. "Sold?" Sloane nodded once. "That appears to be the goal." Mercy House. A white building on the rocky edge of Ashbourne Harbor, wrapped in sea wind and old cedar, where women rebuilding their lives found temporary rooms, legal aid, and quiet. Elena had spent 2 summers there after college helping with grant applications for Julian's grandmother. It was the first place in her adult life that had ever felt unmistakably useful. Her grip tightened around the papers. "Why wasn't I told?" "You were told there were trust consequences." "That is not the same as this." "No," came a low voice from the doorway. "It isn't." Elena turned. Julian stood just inside the room in a dark overcoat beaded with rain, one hand still on the handle as if he had arrived in the middle of a storm and wasn't sure whether to stay. He looked infuriatingly like memory sharpened into flesh. Tall. Controlled. Black hair damp at the temples. Gray tie loosened as though somebody else had just tried to choke him with it. The cold, impossible face that had once made entire rooms fall silent now carried something worse than anger. Regret. Elena's whole body went rigid. "Don't," she said before he could speak. His eyes moved to the file in her hand. "You signed." "Yes, Julian." That was the general theme of the morning. "I told Sloane to slow the filing until I got here." Sloane spoke with admirable neutrality. Traffic from the hearing ran long. Elena looked from one to the other and felt heat rush into her cheeks. "So everyone knew except me." "I knew about the clause," Julian said. "Of course you did." "I didn't know my father's board would try to force the sale this fast." "You're still using the word father as if that man is whether and not choice." A shadow crossed his face, then vanished. Sloane cleared her throat. "I'll give you both a moment." "No," Elena said immediately. "Yes," Julian said at the same time. Sloane, displaying the survival instincts of an excellent attorney, took her tablet and left anyway. The door clicked shut. Rain tapped the glass. Elena faced the man she had once loved hard enough to mistake silence for loyalty and distance for dignity. "Did you know I'd be trapped?" His jaw flexed. "I knew if you signed today, the clause would activate. And you let it happen." "I tried to stop it." "You tried very slowly." He took 2 steps forward, then seemed to think better of a third. "Elena, listen to me carefully. If you walk away now, Mercy House is gone. My father wants the shoreline cleared before the quarter ends. The board wants luxury development permits approved before winter. The only thing standing in their way is the clause you just triggered." Her pulse pounded in her ears. "So I didn't sign myself free," she whispered. Julian's eyes held hers. "No," he said. "You signed yourself into a war." Elena left the building with the file pressed against her ribs and the rain freezing on her bare hands because she had forgotten to put her gloves back on. Manhattan moved around her in streaks of gray and silver, umbrellas bumping her shoulders, car tires hissing through wet streets, somebody shouting for a cab, somebody laughing too loudly from beneath an awning. She barely heard any of it. All she could hear was Julian's voice following her down the elevator, through the lobby, out under the stone awning where she had finally spun around and told him to stop walking after her. He had stopped. That had somehow made it worse. By the time she reached her apartment in the village, her jeans were damp to the knee and her mind had looped the same sentence so many times it no longer sounded like language. "You signed yourself into a war." Her apartment was small, bright, and defiantly hers. Second-hand sofa. Stacks of design books. A half-finished ceramic bowl drying on the windowsill from the night class she'd started taking because making ugly things with her hands felt better than thinking. The radiator hissed. A basil plant drooped on the counter in mute accusation. Elena dropped the file on the table and stared at it as if it might explain itself. Then her phone rang. Nora. Elena answered on the 3rd ring. "If you say congratulations, I'm blocking you." Her best friend was silent for 1 beat. "Okay. That bad?" Elena laughed once. "Worse. Apparently I just signed the divorce and accidentally became co-trustee of a coastal charitable foundation with my estranged husband." Another beat. "You know, sometimes I think my life is chaotic, and then you call." "I'm serious." "I know. That's why I'm sitting down." Elena told her everything. The appendix. The residency clause. Mercy House. The sale. Julian appearing in the doorway like a Gothic omen wearing cashmere. By the end of it, Nora swore with enough creativity to deserve applause. So let me get this straight, Nora said. If you refuse, his family sells the place. Yes. And if you agree, you spend 3 months in close proximity with the emotionally repressed billionaire you are theoretically divorcing. I hate when you reduce my suffering to genre. It becomes more bearable that way. Elena dropped into a chair. I can't do this. There was no immediate joke this time. Nora knew the truth of those words. Not because Elena feared Julian himself, though some damaged and unhealed part of her absolutely did. But because Ashbourne Harbor meant the beginning of everything. Julian before the walls grew teeth. Julian in rolled shirt sleeves laughing on the pier. Julian showing her how to read tide charts like they mattered. Julian bringing coffee to Mercy House volunteers at dawn because his grandmother had raised him to understand that wealth without usefulness was rot. Then later, Ashbourne Harbor had become the place where the cracks first showed. Phone calls taken outside. Meetings that ran late. The tabloid photo of Julian with Celeste Armand outside a hotel in Boston. The lie she had asked him to deny and the silence he had offered instead. The terrible calm with which their marriage had emptied out after that, as if grief had a housekeeping staff and knew exactly where everything belonged. Her gaze fell to the file again. I can't let them sell Mercy House, she said quietly. Nora's answer was immediate. Then don't. It's not that simple. No, it's not. But simple has never actually been your thing. Elena closed her eyes. Mercy House had mattered long before Julian. Long before marriage. When Elena's mother was trying to leave Elena's father for the third and final time, Mercy House's legal clinic had helped her file protective paperwork and find a transitional apartment. Elena had been 16 and furious and terrified, pretending she was too old to notice the trembling in her mother's hands. Places like Mercy House were the reason some women got to start over before the world crushed the idea. If the Mercer board sold it to build glass vacation houses for people who visited twice a year, Elena would never forgive herself. Not for signing. Not for leaving. Not for any of it. By evening, Julian sent a single email. Car will collect you Sunday at 10. Main residence is prepared, but you may use the East Wing if preferred. You will have complete access to Foundation records upon arrival. I know you do not owe me trust. I am asking only that you give Mercy House the same loyalty you once gave my grandmother. No flourish. No apology. No attempt to soften the blade. Just Julian, as always, choosing precision over pleading. Elena read the message 6 times. Then she opened a second attachment Sloane had forwarded, current board proposal summary. Luxury redevelopment. Temporary closure of the recovery center. Staff reductions labeled operational efficiencies. Land transfer options. Her throat tightened. There it was. The translation of polite corporate murder. At 9:30, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Julian's driver, Louis, holding an umbrella and a small flat box. Mr. Mercer asked me to bring this, he said. I'm not going. He said you would say that. Of course he did. Elena took the box with suspicion, closed the door, and opened it on the kitchen counter. Inside was an old brass key on a navy ribbon and a handwritten note in Julian's unmistakable script. The blue room is still yours if you want it. If you don't, I'll understand. She stared at the words until they blurred. The blue room. Not the main suite where they had slept as husband and wife. Not the grand west rooms his mother adored. The small corner bedroom on the 3rd floor overlooking the harbor, where Elena had stayed the summer she first met his grandmother, where she had spent nights drafting grant letters and listening to gulls cry over black water. A room that had never belonged to Mercer Money. A room that had once belonged, quietly, to her. She sat on the floor with the key in her palm and understood, finally, that Julian had not sent it as persuasion. He had sent it as surrender. On Sunday morning she packed 1 suitcase, 1 laptop bag, 2 pairs of boots, and enough anger to keep herself warm for a century. The car arrived at 10 exactly. Louis loaded her bags without comment. The city unspooled behind them in bridges, tunnels, and long winter roads. By the time the skyline gave way to coastal gray and wind-bent pines, Elena had read the Trust Appendix 3 more times and hated it with increasing sophistication. 90 days. Joint review. On-site residency. Final vote. As the car turned through the stone gates of Ashbourne House, the Atlantic rose beyond the cliffs like dark hammered steel. The mansion stood above it, old and severe and beautiful in the ruinous way only very rich families managed, all granite walls and ivy stripped bare by wind. Louis stopped beneath the portico. The front doors opened before Elena could reach them. Mrs. Doran, the longtime housekeeper, stepped out with tears already bright in her eyes. "Oh," she said softly. "You came." Elena's breath caught. Then, from the shadows of the entry hall, Julian emerged in shirt-sleeves with his tie undone, foundation ledgers in one hand and exhaustion carved into every line of his face. "You're late," she said, because it was easier than admitting her heart had just remembered him. A faint, tired almost smile touched his mouth. "You still came," he replied. Ashbourne House had always sounded different from any place Elena had ever known. New York hummed. Apartments rattled. Elevators sighed. Streets shouted. But Ashbourne breathed. Wind moved through the chimneys with a low ocean note. Old floorboards carried footsteps like gossip. Somewhere far below, waves struck the cliff with the patience of things that had outlived every human argument. Mrs. Doran insisted on feeding Elena before anyone discussed business, which meant 20 minutes later she was seated at the breakfast room table with tea, soup, thick bread, and Julian across from her pretending not to watch whether she ate enough. The domestic familiarity of it felt almost violent. "You don't need to stare," Elena said without looking up. "I'm not staring. You're auditing my soup consumption." He folded his hands. "You skipped lunch the day we got married and nearly fainted in the courthouse hallway." "I'm adjusting for history." The memory arrived too fast, rain on the courthouse steps, Elena laughing in damp boots, Julian holding a paper bag of sandwiches he had bought from a deli because he claimed marriage should not begin with low blood sugar. She pushed the memory away so hard it almost hurt. "This isn't history," she said. "It's a compliance visit." His expression shuddered. "Of course." After breakfast he took her through the foundation offices, which occupied the old eastern wing overlooking the harbor. The rooms smelled of salt, cedar, and printer toner. There were filing cabinets, community maps pinned to corkboards, donation reports, permit requests, outreach rosters, and a wall-sized calendar crowded with volunteer shifts. Mercy House itself sat half a mile down the coast, but the Foundation's records and legal archive were kept here under Ashbourne's supervision. Elena dropped her bag in an empty office and started reading. Within an hour, her anger gained structure. The board had been moving money through development consultancies with names that meant nothing. Maintenance budgets for Mercy House had been cut 3/4 in 6 months. The school annex renovation had stalled while private shoreline survey invoices doubled. Somebody was starving the charitable arm and preparing to call it unsustainable. Julian leaned against the office doorframe while she worked. He had shed the coat and tie, and somehow that made him more dangerous, not less. He looked less like Julian Mercer, executive vice president of Mercer Holdings, and more like the man she had once caught on a ladder repainting a storm-damaged boathouse because he trusted his own hands more than hired contractors. "You knew," she said. "Yes." "How long?" "Long enough to start gathering evidence. Not long enough to stop the first transfers." She turned another page. "Why not go public?" "Because the board would deny everything, move the accounts again, and accuse me of sabotaging my father's redevelopment plan because of family drama. So instead you waited for me to accidentally sign a trap." His mouth tightened. "I told you I tried to stop the filing." You also let your lawyers send me documents dense enough to suffocate a horse. I assumed your attorney would review every line. She did. She just didn't understand the board plan to weaponize it immediately. No, he said quietly. They didn't tell her that. Elena looked up. Who is they? He held her gaze. My father. My brother. Two outside directors who have wanted the shoreline for years. A knock interrupted them. Mrs. Doran appeared with a tray and the expression of a woman who had raised 3 generations of difficult people and feared none of them. Miss Mara Quinn is here from Mercy House. Elena stood at once. Send her in. Mara entered carrying wet files and cold air. She was in her early 40s, with dark curls pinned badly under a knit hat and the brisk exhaustion of someone holding together more lives than her own. She stopped when she saw Elena, then broke into startled relief. You're really here. For my sins. Mara laughed, then hugged her hard enough to crack ribs. Good. Because if I had to listen to one more man in a navy suit explain strategic realignment, I was going to commit a felony. Julian took the insult with the calm of a man accustomed to being the nearest acceptable target. They spent the afternoon at Mercy House. The building stood against the winter sea with white clapboard siding and blue shutters faded by salt. Wind bells chimed on the porch. Inside there was warmth, old rugs, mismatched lamps, a bulletin board full of job postings and legal clinic hours, children's drawings taped beside emergency contact numbers, and the unmistakable scent of coffee, detergent, and people trying. Elena walked through the halls as memory opened beneath every step. The upstairs room where she once helped a woman practice for a custody hearing. The library alcove Julian's grandmother had funded because she believed quiet was a human right. The kitchen table scarred by years of women who arrived terrified and left standing straighter. Mara showed her the cracks the board had ignored. A faulty boiler. Leaking windows. Delayed counseling contracts. Supply orders held for review. Elena's fury turned cold and usable. On the drive back to the house, she and Julian sat in silence while rain stitched the windshield. Finally she said, "If I help save this place, don't mistake that for forgiving you." He kept his eyes on the road. "I won't." Good. Another mile passed. "You still think I betrayed you," he said. The words were not defensive. That almost made them worse. Elena looked out at the sea. "I think there was a photograph. I think there were months of lies. I think every time I asked a direct question, you answered with silence. You can choose your preferred vocabulary from there." His hands tightened on the wheel. "Not every silence is guilt. No. Sometimes it's cowardice." He flinched very slightly, and because Elena had once known him better than anyone, she saw it. When they reached the house, Mrs. Doran informed them that Victoria Mercer would arrive the following afternoon for a board dinner. Elena nearly laughed. "Your mother is coming here." Julian's face took on the expression of a man informed that wolves had learned to use cutlery. "Unfortunately." "Does she know I'm here?" "She knows everything." Elena took the brass key from her pocket and headed for the stairs. Then let her enjoy the shock. The blue room waited at the top of the house exactly as Julian's note had promised. White curtains. Iron bed. Bookshelf under the window. A navy quilt folded neatly at the foot. Beyond the glass, the harbor stretched black and silver under a bruised sky. For one reckless second, Elena was 26 again, standing in this room with wet hair and Grant drafts, hearing Julian knock softly on the doorframe because he had brought her tea and wanted an excuse to look at her. Now the room felt preserved, not innocent. A museum of a self she had once been. She set down her suitcase and noticed one change. On the desk beneath the window sat a ceramic bowl. Uneven. Blue glazed. Slightly lopsided. One she had made in college and thought she'd broken years ago. Julian had kept it. Elena touched the rim with one finger, then withdrew her hand like the thing was hot. Downstairs a door shut. Voices moved through the hall. The house settled around her with old, listening patience. She had come to save a foundation. She had not expected the house itself to become evidence. That night she slept badly and dreamed of signatures that turned into chains. At dawn she woke to gulls and the pale wash of winter light. On the desk beside the ceramic bowl lay a single typed schedule for the next 10 days. Site inspections. Audit review. Board dinner. Harbor Council meeting. Resident interviews. Donation hearing. At the bottom, in Julian's handwriting, were 5 words. I know this is impossible. Elena stared at them a long time. Then she picked up a pen and wrote beneath them. Try harder. Victoria Mercer arrived at 4 in the afternoon wrapped in camel wool and authority. She did not enter rooms so much as correct them. The staff straightened without appearing to. Even the air seemed to arrange itself more neatly when she crossed the threshold. She kissed Julian once on the cheek, glanced over his shoulder, and found Elena standing near the library fire with a folder in her arms. For one polished second, nobody spoke. Then Victoria smiled the way expensive knives gleam. Elena, she said. What an unexpected pleasure. Given the paperwork, I'm starting to suspect the word unexpected has lost all meaning. Julian made a sound that might have been a cough or a warning. Victoria removed her gloves finger by finger. You look well. I look legally ambushed. Yes, Victoria said pleasantly. That too. Dinner was served in the smaller dining room, which in Mercer language meant only 1 chandelier and a table fit for 12. Julian sat at the head. Victoria chose the opposite end. Elena found herself at his right, which felt strategic in ways she did not trust. Owen Mercer arrived 10 minutes late smelling of expensive cologne and weather, his blonde charm sliding into the room before him like advance propaganda. Elena, he said, delighted. I heard a rumor and refused to believe it. Try harder, she said. He grinned and kissed the air near her cheek anyway. If Julian was control hardened into elegance, Owen was ease weaponized into plausible deniability. Same family bones. Different moral weather. He had once been the brother who smuggled Elena bourbon at Christmas and called her the only good decision Julian ever made. Now he sat across from her discussing coastal projections as if her marriage had not collapsed under a fog of secrets his family had helped produce. By the second course Elena understood the purpose of the dinner. It was not welcome. It was pressure in crystal glassware. Victoria spoke of transition planning. Owen mentioned market confidence. 2 outside trustees joining by video praised the value of modernization. Julian answered minimally, eyes cold. Elena listened until the language turned familiar in the worst way. Underutilized coastal asset. Repositioned service model. Managed closure timeline. She put down her fork. Mercy House is not an underutilized asset, she said. It's full. Silence. One trustee blinked at the screen. Victoria dabbed her mouth with linen. Owen leaned back with open curiosity, as if this were entertainment. Elena went on. The recovery rooms are occupied. The legal clinic has a waiting list. The child counseling program is at capacity. If you mean it doesn't generate luxury margins, then yes, perhaps it has disappointed you by being a shelter instead of a marina. The trustee tried a patient smile. No one is dismissing the emotional value of the property. Good, Elena said. Because the legal value is also inconvenient for you. I spent most of today reviewing misallocated maintenance reserves, concealed consultant billing, and pre-sale survey authorizations the board apparently approved before charitable review was complete. Should I continue before dessert, or would anyone like to stop pretending this is procedural? Owen let out a low whistle. Victoria's gaze rested on Elena with a new, sharper interest. You have been busy. Women usually are when men underestimate them. Julian did not look at her, but she felt something change in the air beside him. Not possession. Not triumph. Recognition. The meeting adjourned without a vote. Afterward, Owen cornered Elena in the gallery outside the dining room, where portraits of dead Mercers watched the living disappoint them. He leaned against the wall with his hands in his pockets and the lazy expression of a man who wanted to seem harmless. "You always did enjoy a fire," he said. "You always did enjoy standing near one someone else lit." His smile widened. "There she is." Elena folded her arms. "What do you want?" "To offer friendly advice. That alone makes me suspicious." His gaze drifted toward the windows. "My brother is very good at being the saddest man in the room. Don't let that confuse you. He can outmaneuver anyone when he decides it matters. That family trait seems broadly distributed." "True," Owen said. "Which is why you should ask yourself something. Of all the ways Julian could have handled this, why did he let you sign first?" Before Elena could answer, he pushed away from the wall and left her with that sentence like a tack under the skin. She found Julian in the study with his jacket off and his tie discarded, standing over a spread of ledgers and harbor plats. Firelight moved over his face, carving out the exhaustion under his eyes. "Owen thinks you're manipulating me," she said. Julian didn't look up. "Owen thinks projection is a leadership principle. That is not a denial." Now he did lift his head. "You want one?" "Yes." He held her gaze. "I did not activate the clause to trap you here. I activated it because my grandmother wrote it for exactly this possibility." Elena stared at him. "What possibility?" "That the board would try to gut the foundation the minute she died, and that I would need someone they couldn't buy." She almost laughed. "You picked your estranged wife?" "No," he said quietly. "She did." The words landed harder than she expected. His grandmother, Eleanor Mercer, had died 8 months earlier. Even now Elena could picture her exactly, silver hair twisted up with pencils, sea-green scarves, a voice so soft it forced everyone else to lower theirs. Eleanor had built Mercy House after her sister vanished into an abusive marriage nobody with money had bothered to name. She used to say charity was too often organized guilt and that what women needed instead was power with locks on the doors. "She put me in the clause," Elena said slowly. Julian nodded. "Years ago." "Why?" His answer came without hesitation. "Because she trusted you more than she trusted us." The fire cracked. Elena looked away first. That night the wind rose hard off the water. She couldn't sleep, so just before midnight she pulled on a coat and went downstairs for tea. A strip of light showed beneath the library door. She found Julian inside, sleeves rolled, tie gone, reading an old leather journal at his grandmother's desk. He closed it when he saw her. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "You didn't." She crossed to the kettle on the sideboard. "Can't sleep?" "No." Rich people always look disappointed when insomnia turns out to be universal. Something almost like amusement touched his mouth. She poured hot water into 2 cups without asking whether he wanted one. Old habits were dangerous because the body remembered them before the mind could object. When she handed him the cup, their fingers brushed. Such a small thing. Such an absurd thing, that skin could still carry history like a live wire. Julian stared into the tea. "The photograph from Boston," he said at last. Elena went still. "I know that's where you began leaving me." "Began?" "It wasn't the whole story." "No," she said. "It never was. That was the problem." He set the cup down. "If I tell you now, it will sound convenient. Then maybe you should have tried when I was still your wife." He absorbed that without defense, which only sharpened her anger. She turned toward the door. "Elena." She stopped but did not face him. "The woman in the photograph was not my affair," he said. Her throat tightened. Then he added, very quietly, she was my sister. Elena turned so fast the tea in her cup sloshed over her hand. What? Julian stood motionless beside the fire, as if abrupt movement might fracture whatever fragile bridge the truth had managed to lay between them. Half-sister, he said. My father's daughter. Her name is Celeste Armand. The room seemed to tilt. The photograph flashed back with brutal clarity, Julian outside the Clarion Hotel in Boston, one hand on a woman's elbow, his face turned down toward hers with a tenderness Elena had thought she recognized because once it had belonged to her. The tabloids had called Celeste a French consultant. The blogs had upgraded her to mistress by morning. You let me believe that. His eyes closed briefly. I let you believe something was wrong. I thought I could contain the rest. Contain. Elena gave a strangled laugh. That is such a Julian word. Did you think if you managed the scandal cleanly enough, my humiliation would become efficient? It wasn't about efficiency. Then what was it about? He moved to the window, then back again, a man with nowhere in the room he could stand that would make him less guilty. Celeste's mother had an airtight non-disclosure agreement with my father. When she died, Celeste contacted me, not him. She had rehab debt, a publicist threatening to sell the story, and a collapse I was trying to keep out of the papers because if my mother learned the full timeline of my father's affair while she was already recovering from surgery. He stopped. Somewhere beneath Elena's anger, a separate ache opened. Victoria's surgery. That winter. The months the family had moved like people arranging flowers around rot. I asked if there was someone else, Elena said. I know. You looked me in the face and said this is complicated. It was. It was yes or no. His jaw tightened. It was not yes. But it was not mine alone to expose. Elena set her cup down because her hand had begun to shake. You always do this. You take pain, wrap it in responsibility, and then act surprised when it dies in your hands. His voice went low. You think I don't know that? She stared at him. There it was again, not anger this time but something harder to answer. Damage. Self-knowledge. The terrible clarity of a man who had watched his own choices destroy what he loved and understood too late that intention would never acquit him. Why didn't you trust me? She asked. I did. No. He looked at the floor. I trusted you to love me. I did not trust the fallout. The honesty of it hit harder than excuse would have. Elena pressed her hand to the edge of the desk. You chose your family. I chose triage. You chose without me. Silence stretched. Then Julian said, yes. That one word, stripped of defense, made it impossible to keep shouting. Elena hated that most of all. She left the library before he could say anything more, but sleep still did not come. Instead she lay staring into the dark while the house moaned softly in the wind and her mind rearranged old memories against new truth. Not forgiven. Not solved. But altered. In the morning, work resumed with almost savage relief. They spent hours in the archive room sorting grant histories and trustee meeting minutes. Elena found a string of signed pre-approvals dated before Eleanor Mercer's death, which meant somebody had begun positioning Mercy House for sale while the old woman was still alive. Julian found linked shell consultancies tied to one outside director and a development firm Owen had recommended for coastal optimization. By noon they had enough to prove corruption existed, but not enough to prove who had engineered it. Mara arrived with resident testimony summaries and 3 boxes of maintenance invoices. Mrs. Doran brought sandwiches and a stare that communicated disappointment any time either Elena or Julian forgot to eat. For the first time since Elena had arrived, their work rhythm returned, not marriage, not ease, but the old practical coordination that had once made them formidable. Julian built timelines on whiteboards. Elena cross-referenced authorizations. They interrupted each other, corrected each other, and occasionally reached for the same document at the same time. At one point their hands collided over a ledger. Neither moved. It was absurd how much silence could fit inside a touch. Julian withdrew first. Sorry. Elena looked back at the numbers. You keep apologizing like it's a new language. It is. Late that afternoon, Elena walked alone down to Mercy House. The sky was clear for once, winter blue cut by screaming gulls. She found Mara on the porch smoking an emergency cigarette she insisted did not count because she was angry, not addicted. Mara listened to the Boston story without interrupting. When Elena finished, she flicked ash into the wind. Men born into powerful families always think silence is noble when they're the ones controlling it. That is uncomfortably precise. I run a shelter. Precision is a side effect. Elena leaned against the railing. I don't know what to do with the fact that he didn't cheat. Who said that was the only thing that matters? Elena exhaled. Mara softened. Listen. Truth changes weight. It doesn't erase impact. You're allowed to revise the story without pretending the damage was imaginary. On the walk back, Elena replayed those words. Revise the story. Ashbourne House glowed ahead of her in the dusk, windows lit gold against the dark sea. Inside she found Victoria in the drawing room, alone for once, a glass of wine in hand and no audience to perform for. Sit, Victoria said. I'd rather stand. Of course you would. Elena stayed by the mantel. Victoria studied her over the rim of the glass. My mother-in-law adored you. Eleanor had excellent judgment. Yes, Victoria said. Usually. Elena should have left. Instead she heard herself ask, did you know about the clause? Victoria did not bother pretending confusion. Naturally. And nobody thought to mention it before I signed. My mother-in-law believed surprises revealed character. That sounds charming when you're not the surprise. A faint smile. Gone quickly. She also believed Julian would need someone who could survive this family without becoming it. And did she believe I would enjoy being used as an anti-corruption device? Victoria set down the glass. If you are waiting for me to defend what was done to you, don't. The men in this family mistake containment for care. It has ruined them. The admission startled Elena more than denial would have. Victoria's gaze shifted to the dark window. I stayed for reasons that made sense at the time. Women of my generation were trained to call endurance virtue. Eleanor did not agree. She built Mercy House because she wanted at least one place under this family's name where women were not required to disappear politely. Elena heard the confession beneath the sentence and understood, suddenly, that Victoria's polish had always been armor, not absence. Then help me save it, Elena said. Victoria looked back at her. That depends. Are you here to punish Julian, or are you here to win? Before Elena could answer, the study door burst open downstairs. Footsteps pounded through the hall. A junior accountant from the foundation office appeared breathless at the drawing room entrance. Mr. Mercer, he said, seeing Julian coming behind him. The external backup drive is gone. Julian stopped dead. What? The one with the archive transfer records. It's missing. Elena's pulse spiked. Because she knew exactly what had been on that drive. And exactly how much trouble someone was in if they were desperate enough to steal it. The house changed the instant the missing drive was confirmed. Footsteps quickened. Doors opened and shut. Staff searched offices, drawers, briefcases, and cabinets with the rigid efficiency of people trying not to panic in front of the wealthy. Julian locked down the archive wing, called the security company, and demanded footage from every interior corridor. Elena stood in the office doorway with cold running through her limbs, watching the whiteboard timeline as if the erased truth might still be visible there. The drive had contained backup scans of authorization chains Julian had pulled from an older server system 2 days earlier. Signatures. Board memos. Payment routing. Enough to make denials difficult. Enough to make somebody reckless. Who had access? Elena asked. Julian listed names. Foundation staff. 2 house employees. Security. Himself. Elena. Nobody else officially. Officially, she repeated. He met her eyes. Yes. By midnight they had footage of a hooded figure entering the East Archive corridor during the dinner and leaving 6 minutes later with nothing visible in hand. No face. No clear height. No useful angle. Whoever it was knew where the blind spots were. Owen, Elena said. Maybe. You don't sound convinced. Because he likes using other people's fingerprints. The next morning Julian drove Elena into town for a scheduled Harbor Council meeting that suddenly mattered more than ever. Without the backup drive, proving intent would be harder. So would stopping the sale if the board accelerated. Wind whipped off the sea, snapping flags over the brick municipal building. Local shop owners, volunteers, and Mercy House staff crowded the small chamber with the wary attentiveness of people who had learned that polite civic language often preceded private devastation. Elena spoke first. She had not planned to, but when the council chair began referring to Mercy House as a site under strategic evaluation, something inside her sharpened cleanly. She stood, laid out the current occupancy numbers, listed services the house provided, identified pending contractual irregularities, and made the sale sound exactly like what it was, an attempt to convert social vulnerability into high-end waterfront acreage. The room shifted with her. Julian spoke after, and Elena watched the council members react to the version of him they almost never saw. He was still controlled, still impossible, but stripped now of corporate polish. He spoke about fiduciary duty, yes, but also about Eleanor Mercer's founding purpose, about the legal obligation to community reliance, about how institutions that mattered were often most vulnerable when they became inconvenient to quarterly strategy. He did not perform remorse. He did not ask for admiration. He simply stood there and made betrayal expensive. When the meeting ended, the chair agreed to delay any zoning cooperation until the trust review was complete. It was a win. A small one. But real. Outside, the winter sun had broken through in fractured bands over the harbor. Mara hugged Elena hard enough to lift her off balance. Volunteers thanked her. One of the older residents from Mercy House pressed a knitted glove into Elena's hand because she'd noticed Elena had lost one and said practical things mattered more than pride. Julian waited near the truck, watching her with a look Elena could not safely interpret. Don't, she said quietly when she reached him. Don't what? Look at me like that. Like what? Like I'm still someone you know. His expression changed, not retreat, not challenge, something sadder. You are. They drove back in silence until Elena said, My father used to do that. Julian glanced over. Do what? Talk about institutions like they were sacred and people like they were collateral. Julian's grip tightened on the wheel, but he did not interrupt. Elena rarely spoke about her father. Gerard Hart had been a labor attorney with a gift for sounding ethical in public and authoritarian in private. When Elena's mother finally left him, he reinvented himself as a victim of unstable women and raised Elena inside that narrative until she learned to distrust her own reactions. Julian had been the first man who never once told her she was too much. The irony that he still broke her through silence instead of control was not lost on her. My father called Mercy House a place for women who didn't understand loyalty, Elena said. My mother called it the first locked door she'd ever slept behind that felt kind. Julian was quiet for a long time. I didn't know he said that. There are a lot of things you didn't know because I was busy trying not to become the girl with the dramatic family. His voice came low. You never had to hide that from me. No. I only thought I did. When they reached the house, Louis met them in the drive with a sealed overnight envelope addressed to Elena. No return name. No stamp. Hand delivered. Inside was a copy of the missing drive's contents printed in reduced format and one handwritten line on plain paper. Ask your father where Owen Mercer sent the first payment. Elena felt the world narrow to a pinpoint. Julian read the note over her shoulder, then looked at her face and understood something terrible at the same moment she did. My father, she whispered. Back in the study, she called Gerard Hart and got voicemail. She called again. Nothing. By the fourth attempt her hands were shaking hard enough that Julian took the phone from her, set it down, and said, Sit. I am not sitting. Elena. He told me you were stalling the divorce because you wanted leverage over my apartment lease and the studio account. He told me the Boston woman was old news in your circles. He told me your family had paid off reporters. Julian said nothing. Because none of that sounded impossible. She turned away, breath jagged. If my father took money from Owen. We don't know that yet. Don't protect him. I'm not. I'm trying to stop you from building a verdict before we have proof. She laughed without humor. You really do only love women during cross-examination. That hit. She knew at the moment his face changed. Regret moved through her almost instantly, but pride kept its hand on the door. Before either of them could say more, Sloane called on speaker with new information. One of the shell consultancies had a registered agent tied to Gerard Hart's old firm. Not current. Old. Dormant for years. Recently reactivated. The room went silent. Elena sat then because her knees stopped offering alternatives. Memories came back in violent fragments. Her father insisting she move the last of her personal savings after the separation because Mercer accountants would bury her in disclosures. Her father reviewing the first draft of the divorce packet before Sloane did because he knew how these people operated. Her father pushing urgency. Sign quickly. Be done. Don't let them drag you into their games. Julian crouched in front of her, careful not to touch her. Look at me. She did. This may involve him, he said. That does not make it your fault. The gentleness in his voice almost undid her. She swallowed hard. What if he helped them? Then we find out why. And if the why is money? Julian's answer was steady. Then we survive that too. That night Elena went to the archive alone and read until dawn. By sunrise she had found the first transfer. Not to Gerard Hart directly. To a legal services retainer signed by a retired partner who had once mentored him. Routed 3 times. Hidden badly, if you knew where to look. At the bottom of the page was a note authorizing expedited personal influence management. Elena stared at those words until she understood their true meaning. Someone had not only tried to control the sale. Someone had tried to control her. And suddenly the divorce no longer looked like collateral damage. It looked designed. By morning the storm had moved offshore, leaving the harbor bright and brutal under a hard blue sky. Elena had not slept. Her eyes burned. Her coffee went cold twice. Julian found her in the archive room surrounded by files, legal pads, and the particular stillness of a person holding anger together with precision. You've been here all night. Yes. He took in the papers and understood she had crossed some internal line. What did you find? Elena slid the document toward him. He read it once, then again more slowly. His face did not visibly change, but she saw the control lock into place behind his eyes. This was authorized 6 weeks before you filed, he said. I know. Influence management. I know. He set the page down very carefully. This was not about speeding a divorce. No, Elena said. It was about steering me into one. The truth, once named, began arranging everything that had felt random. Gerard pushing urgency. Owen suddenly helpful during the separation. The leaked gossip items that kept Elena publicly embarrassed enough to avoid any extended fight. Even Sloane's confusion made more sense now. The goal had not been simply to end the marriage. The goal had been to make Elena sign quickly, angrily, and without reading enough to understand what power she was triggering. Why? Julian asked. Elena laughed softly, bitterly. Because they assumed I'd be emotional and careless. No, his voice cut clean through hers. Why trigger the clause at all if the clause gave you veto power? That stopped her. For a moment they both stood there in the thin morning light, thinking. Then Julian said, unless Owen believed he could control you after it activated. Elena saw it all at once. Gerard reassuring her. Owen charming her. The Mercers making her feel outmatched. Everyone working from the assumption that Elena, once isolated, exhausted, and furious, would become the easiest piece on the board. Except Eleanor Mercer had written the trust with a cruelty sharper than theirs. Once activated, Elena was not decorative. She was decisive. She outplayed them from the grave, Elena murmured. Julian almost smiled. That sounds like her. At 10, Gerard finally called back. Elena took the call in the glass conservatory off the West Hall, with Julian visible through the doorway and pretending not to hover. Her father's voice arrived warm, affronted, familiar. Darling, I was in meetings. You've called 6 times. You took money connected to Owen Mercer. Silence. A tiny silence. But enough. You shouldn't be digging through Mercer records. Answer me. Her father exhaled as though she were being difficult at dinner. I accepted a consulting retainer related to reputational mitigation. English. I advised on how to protect you. By helping force my divorce. By getting you out before that family buried you alive. Elena's grip tightened on the phone. You pushed me to sign. Yes, he said. Because dragging things out with men like that is how women lose. Women like who? Women who still think love is a contract the rich intend to honor. She almost choked on the hypocrisy. You told me Julian had leverage over my accounts. He could have. You told me the woman in Boston was proof. It was enough proof. No. It was enough to make me leave. Her father's patience frayed. Elena, listen carefully. Mercer Holdings intended to redevelop that entire coast years ago. Eleanor was the obstacle. Once she died, the house would fall. If your signature triggered a review period, that only bought time. Time is useful. I did what I had to do. Julian stepped closer in the doorway, hearing only Elena's side and reading the rest from her face. You took money, she said. A legal retainer. You sold access to me. I gave advice that benefited you. No, Elena said, voice shaking now for reasons far older than this week. You gave advice that let powerful men move me around while calling it protection. You have done that my entire life. He went cold. That is an ungrateful thing to say. There it was. The old lever. Gratitude as leash. Elena felt something inside her settle. Not break. Settle. You don't get to use that word with me anymore, she said. She ended the call before he could answer. When she looked up, Julian was still in the doorway, his face unreadable. He admitted enough, she said. Julian nodded once. I recorded the call from the second sentence. Elena stared, then let out the first genuine laugh she'd had in days. That is deeply unethical. Only if I deny it later. By afternoon they had a strategy. Sloane would petition emergency expansion of trustee review authority using the recorded admission, the retainer documents, and the missing drive copies. Mara would organize resident impact statements for public submission. Victoria, after one long private conversation with Julian that left him looking like he'd gone 12 rounds with history, agreed to break board alignment if Elena could prove Owen's direct involvement. Lewis quietly produced security logs showing Owen's driver had entered the East Service corridor during the dinner. Mrs. Doran produced something better, a memory. She had seen Owen speaking with Gerard Hart on the back terrace 2 months earlier at a memorial luncheon neither man was officially attending. Every wall began to crack at once. That evening Elena stood on the cliff path above the harbor while the sky turned rose and steel. Julian found her there with 2 coats draped over one arm and silence in his expression. He held one out. "It's colder than you think." She took it. "You always say that like weather is a moral failure." He looked toward the sea. "I say it because you still walk into wind unbuttoned." The familiarity of the sentence hurt in a new way now. Softer. More dangerous. For a while they said nothing. Waves struck rock below. Far downshore, lights had begun to glow at Mercy House. "My father once told me that if I ever married a man richer than him, I should make sure I stayed indispensable," Elena said. "At the time I thought he was giving practical advice. Now I think he was admitting how he understood love." Julian's jaw tightened. "That isn't love." "No. It isn't." She turned to him. "Did you know he was pushing me?" "Not at first. I knew he was hostile. I didn't know he was coordinated." "And Owen?" "I suspected. I couldn't prove it." "Why didn't you tell me you suspected anyone was trying to manipulate the filing?" He took a breath. "Because by then, you already looked at me like every word I spoke required a receipt." It was such an exact sentence that Elena could not deflect it. "That was your fault," she said quietly. "I know." He said it so simply she felt the fight leave her shoulders. Then he added, "But it was also killing me." Wind lifted her hair across her face. He reached out on instinct to move it, stopped himself an inch away, and let his hand fall. That almost undone gesture carried more intimacy than touch would have. "Elena," he said, eyes on hers, "I cannot ask you to trust me because I have not earned it. I can only tell you this. I did not let you go because I stopped loving you. I let you go because by the time I understood how badly I'd failed you, every attempt to explain sounded like another strategy." Her throat tightened. "And because you are proud," she whispered. His mouth curved faintly. Violently. "Good. I hated being the only one." He laughed then, low and brief and startlingly familiar. The sound moved through her like remembered light. When it faded, the quiet between them changed. Not healed. But alive. At dinner that night, Elena found a sealed packet beside her plate. No note. Inside was a certified copy of an amendment Eleanor Mercer had added to the trust 3 years earlier, 6 days after Elena married Julian. "If at any point my grandson forgets that partnership without truth is merely possession with better tailoring, let Elena decide what survives him." Elena looked up slowly. Across the table, Julian had gone still. "She never showed me that," he said. Elena folded the paper once. "Maybe she assumed I'd need it when you annoyed me." Mrs. Doran snorted into the soup. For the first time since arriving, Elena felt the shape of victory. Not because the board was cornered. Not because Owen was sloppy. But because the story they had built around her, careless wife, wounded woman, movable piece, was collapsing under the simple inconvenience of her attention. And she was no longer interested in surviving their design. She wanted to ruin it. The emergency trustee hearing was set for Friday at noon in the Ashbourne House ballroom, because Mercer families preferred to collapse publicly only in rooms with very good molding. By Thursday night the house was full. Outside counsel. Board members. Accountants. 2 public relations consultants pretending not to be public relations consultants. Victoria's discreet allies. Sloane with 3 bankers' boxes and the expression of a woman who had sharpened herself for sport. Owen arrived last, smiling like a man attending his own surprise party. "Elena," he said warmly. "I hear you've become industrious." I hear you've become sloppy. He laughed and bent to kiss Victoria's cheek. Julian watched him the way men watch live wires near standing water. The hearing began with formality and broke almost immediately into blood. Sloane presented the trust appendix, the emergency stay language, the recorded call from Gerard Hart, the shell retainer documents, the consultant chains, and the first tranche of maintenance diversion evidence. Owen's counsel objected so often the rhythm became comic. Elena sat at the long table beside Julian, spine straight, hands steady, every nerve sharpened to cold purpose. Then came the question of intent. Why had the board accelerated sale motions before the review? Why had Shell consultants been paid? Why had the drive gone missing? Why had Elena been steered so aggressively toward immediate signature? One outside director attempted outrage. Another claimed administrative misunderstanding. Victoria dismantled both with surgical restraint. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She merely produced board correspondence Owen had sent from a private address, suggesting that emotional instability on Elena's side made rapid execution strategically advantageous. The phrase landed in the room like acid. Owen's smile thinned. Julian went very still beside her. Then Sloane called the accountant who had first noticed the reserve discrepancies. He testified with the frightened honesty of a man who had spent 3 sleepless nights deciding whether he preferred unemployment or perjury. He confirmed that instructions regarding Mercy House had repeatedly come through Owen's office, not Julian's, and that specific care had been taken to keep Elena's trustee activation off ordinary briefing summaries. Not illegal in isolation. Damning in aggregate. When Owen finally spoke, he did so with wounded elegance. We are turning family grief and marital breakdown into conspiracy because my brother cannot accept that some institutions must evolve. Eliminate, Elena said. You mean eliminate? He looked at her with almost affectionate contempt. I mean stop romanticizing inefficiency. And I mean stop laundering greed through managerial vocabulary. The chair called for order. Then Julian did something Elena had not expected. He stood, placed both hands on the polished table, and said, My brother is correct about one thing. This is not only about Mercy House. It is about a long family habit of deciding which lives are expendable once they become inconvenient. My grandmother built the foundation to interrupt that habit. I failed that mission once already in my marriage. I will not fail it here. The silence that followed belonged to truth, not theater. Elena looked at him then, really looked, and understood why the room had shifted. Not because he was powerful. Because he had finally stopped protecting power from consequence. The final blow came from an unexpected source. Lewis entered quietly, crossed to Sloane, and handed her a printed still from a traffic camera outside the house on the night the drive disappeared. Owen's driver. Gerard Hart's former investigator. Same vehicle frame, same timestamp, back service road. Sloane passed it forward. Victoria closed her eyes once, as if disappointment required a ritual. Owen's counsel requested recess. Denied. The trustees withdrew for private deliberation. Nobody breathed normally for 22 minutes. Elena stood by the far windows with the sea spread below her like torn metal. Julian approached but stopped an arm's length away. If we lose, he said, the appeal will buy some time. We're not losing. His mouth curved faintly. There you are. She glanced at him. If you get sentimental before the verdict, I'll throw you out the window. I missed that threat. You deserved it every time. I know. Again that simple answer. Again the disarming absence of defense. The trustees returned. The chair read from a written statement. Emergency sale motions were suspended pending full forensic audit. Owen Mercer and the 2 outside directors were removed from all active authority over trust assets pending investigation. Mercy House and associated charitable properties were placed under interim protection. Final dissolution review, as it related to Elena and Julian's trust responsibilities, would remain open until the audit concluded and successor governance was determined. They had won. Not everything. Not permanently. But enough. Mara cried openly in the back row. Mrs. Doran crossed herself, though nobody was certain she still believed in organized religion. Victoria sat motionless, one hand tight around the stem of her water glass. Owen rose with lethal calm, gathered his papers, and looked at Elena as if memorizing a debt. "This is not over," he said quietly. Elena met his gaze. "For you. I suspect it is just beginning." He left without another word. The ballroom emptied in fragments of relief and adrenaline. Lawyers made calls. Staff hugged in corners. Sloane permitted herself one entire smile before returning to legal triage. Julian stood beside Elena at last, no audience left between them, no emergency large enough to outrun the truth waiting underneath. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she replied, then hated the softness of that sentence because it was true. His eyes searched hers. "Elena." "No," she shook her head. "Not in a ballroom full of the ashes of your family governance." A surprised laugh escaped him. "Tonight," she said. "If you still want to talk, then tonight." His expression changed with something like caution and hope learning to coexist. "I'll still want to talk." That night the house felt different. Not peaceful exactly. More like a building that had survived surgery and was waiting to discover what living would feel like afterward. Elena changed into a navy sweater and jeans, left her hair loose, and went down to the blue room of the West Library where Eleanor had once held informal meetings because she claimed people told the truth more easily near books. Julian was already there, standing by the window with no tie, no jacket, no armor except whatever remained of habit. A decanter sat untouched on the side table. Good, Elena thought. If this conversation required whiskey, they were doomed. For a moment neither spoke. Then Julian said, "I loved you badly." She blinked. Not because the words were romantic. Because they were precise. He went on. Not insufficiently. Not insincerely. Badly. I treated protection like love. Information like burden. Silence like sacrifice. And every time you asked me to stand beside you in truth, I stood between you and it instead. Elena felt her throat tighten. "I don't need apology as performance," she said. "This isn't performance." "No," she said after a beat. "It isn't." He took one step closer. "I don't deserve another chance because I finally understand the shape of my failure. Understanding it late does not make you owe me anything now. That is the best thing you've said in years." I had strong material tonight. Despite herself, she smiled. Then she drew a breath and told him her own truth. About how leaving had felt like choosing oxygen and amputation at the same time. About the humiliation of believing herself foolish. About how his silence had activated every childhood fear she had of loving men who treated closeness like leverage. About how she had missed him even when she wanted never to see his face again. About how discovering he hadn't cheated did not erase the loneliness of being shut out. About how some part of her had hated herself for still wanting him to explain. He listened without interrupting. No corrections. No management. No attempts to improve the version. When she finished, the room was so quiet she could hear waves below the cliff. Julian's voice, when it came, was roughened by restraint. "I want to ask for a future. I know I have no right to ask it quickly." Elena looked at him for a long moment. "Good. Because if you tried, I'd assume you'd suffered a head injury." A breath of laughter moved between them, fragile and real. He came closer then, stopping near enough that she could see the exhaustion in his face and the honesty that had once existed there before generations of Mercer training taught him to bury it under polish. "I cannot offer you a repaired version of the life we had," he said. I don't want that life back. It was elegant and starving. I want something harder. Something truthful. Even if truthful means you decide this ends with the audit. Elena felt the old instinct to protect herself rise first. Then the newer, stranger instinct to answer honestly. I don't know what this becomes, she said. I know I'm not the woman who married you in a courthouse because rain made us reckless and you looked at me like certainty. I know you are not the man I left, either. Which is fortunate, because I was prepared to ruin him. Entirely fair. I'm serious. So am I. She folded her arms, then let them fall again. I need time. You'll have it. I need transparency so aggressive it borders on medical. You can have every password I own. That is a disturbing amount of confidence in romance. I'm trying to adapt. She laughed softly, then sobered. And I need you to understand something. If we try again, this will not be built on your protection. It will be built on partnership. I will not be managed, softened, briefed around, or strategically spared. His gaze never left hers. Understood. Say it like you mean it. I would rather lose you honestly than keep you through distortion. The words entered her like light through a cracked door. She looked down because suddenly looking directly at him was too much. On the table beside the books lay Eleanor's trust amendment, the line about partnership and possession, the dead woman's wicked clarity still rearranging the living. Elena, Julian said quietly. When she looked up, he was closer still. Not touching. Waiting. It would have been easier if desire had vanished with trust. Easier if memory did not live in the body like weather stored in stone. She saw the question in his face and understood that for perhaps the first time in his life, Julian Mercer was asking without assuming. So she answered by stepping into him. The kiss was not reunion. It was recognition with consequences. Careful for half a second, then not careful at all. Months of grief and anger and starving restraint broke open into warmth and breath and the unbelievable familiarity of his mouth. He held her like she was both wanted and breakable, and when her hand slid into his hair she felt the shudder that went through him as if he had been holding himself together by force and had finally been given permission to fail. She pulled back first, breathing hard. This is not absolution, she said. I know. It's not even forgiveness. I know. It might be terrible judgment. At that he smiled, forehead resting briefly against hers. That at least would be familiar. 3 weeks later the audit became public. The newspapers loved it, naturally. Mercer board irregularities. Shell payments. Attempted charitable asset conversion. Quiet ties to outside legal influence. Owen resigned before formal removal. Gerard Hart issued a statement full of strategic regret and no admission worth the paper. Elena ignored every call he made after that. Not because forgiveness was impossible forever, but because distance was finally doing the work she had once expected apology to do. Mercy House stayed open. Donations surged after the story broke. Former residents wrote letters. Volunteers doubled. Contractors offered reduced bids to repair the boiler and windows. The school annex reopened its renovation plan. Mara cried again, which she denied despite all witnesses. Julian stepped down from 2 divisions of Mercer Holdings and announced a restructuring of the charitable arm independent of the development board. The financial press called it surprising. Victoria called it overdue. Mrs. Doran called it the first sensible thing he'd done since age 19. As for Elena, she stayed. Not in the West Suite. Not even in the Blue Room. She rented the old carriage cottage overlooking the harbor path and commuted 3 mornings a week into the city for design clients while helping rebuild the foundation's outreach programs the rest of the time. She liked unlocking her own front door. She liked paying for her own groceries. She liked that when Julian came by in the evenings, he knocked. They were not magically repaired. Some nights a delayed text could still turn the air between them sharp. Some conversations reopened old wounds before they cleaned them. Trust, Elena discovered, did not regrow like ivy. It was masonry. Slow, deliberate, load-bearing, made one chosen piece at a time. Spring came late to Ashbourne Harbour. The first warm afternoon arrived in a spill of silver light over the sea, with daffodils finally opening along the lower stone walls. Elena was on the Mercy House porch reviewing budget revisions when Julian came up the path carrying coffee and a folder. "If this is another trust appendix," she said, "I'm pushing you into the Atlantic." "It's worse." She narrowed her eyes. "Explain." He handed her the folder. Inside was a deed transfer, fully executed. The coastal strip beneath Mercy House, the garden behind it, and the adjoining bluff path had been permanently placed into a protected community land trust under foundation control. No board sale. No luxury conversion. No family override. Elena looked up slowly. "You did this." "We did," he corrected. "You told me institutions survive when no one man can own their future." Her chest tightened. Then she noticed the second paper in the folder. Simpler. Personal. A voluntary resignation from all spousal privilege claims tied to her finances, property, and future earnings, regardless of the final status of their marriage. He had freed her on paper before asking for anything with his heart. Julian set his coffee aside. "The final dissolution hearing is next Thursday." The wind moved gently through the porch screens. "Elena," he said, "if you want the divorce completed, I will sign whatever remains and thank you for every day you still came back here. If you want more time, I'll take it. If you want," he stopped, then started again with less polish and more truth. "If you want a life with me, I would like to build one that deserves you." She stared at him until the world narrowed to porch boards, sea light, and the impossible man in front of her choosing honesty without guarantee. Then she stood, set the folder down, and took his face in both hands. "When I signed those papers," she said, "I thought I was agreeing to an ending." His breath caught. She smiled, small and shaking and real. "Turns out I was only agreeing to read more carefully." When she kissed him this time, the harbor bells downshore began to ring in the wind like a blessing too practical to call itself one.